grass parting as the buffalo was coming towards us. And as he emerged out of the long grass, started to come up the termite mound, I shot him through between the shoulder blades on the hump of his neck, and luckily he dropped right there. But we ended up shooting that buffalo 11 times. And it turned out afterwards that on his vital triangle area, where there were 5 shots through his vital triangle. I put my hand, I could cover all 5 bullet holes with my one hand. And yet that had made no difference to that buffalo whatsoever. He came for us like nothing was wrong with him.
Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hey everybody, John McAdams here. Welcome to episode 124 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Well, this is my first episode of 2021. 2020 might have seemed like it was the longest year ever, but that's in the rearview mirror now. Now, like I mentioned last week, I'm going back to Africa this year since my hunt last year got rescheduled due to COVID. So with that in mind, and since hunting seasons have mostly wrapped up all over the USA by now, I think January is a great time to be talking about hunting in Africa, and I've produced an excellent series of shows on hunting in Africa for the next couple of weeks. Kevin Robertson is back on the show again today, so we are starting the year off on the right foot. He and I talked back in episode 97 about Africa hunting bullets and in episode 103 about Africa hunting rifles. Those are 2 of my most popular episodes ever, so be sure to listen to them if you haven't already done so. Now today, Kevin is going to give us a general overview of Cape buffalo, where they live, an overview of Cape buffalo anatomy, why Cape buffalo are so darn mean and tough, how to evaluate a Cape buffalo trophy, and much more. And he will be back on the show again next week to talk about preparing for a hunt in Africa, especially for Cape buffalo. Now, just like with our previous discussions on bullets, ammo, and rifles, Kevin knows a lot more about the subject than I do, and he literally wrote the book on Cape buffalo. So with all that stuff in mind, we have a great show for you today, and let's get started. All right, well, Kevin, it is great having you back on the show again today for a third time.
My pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
You know, so we have started our last 2 interviews with stories about how you have seen things go sideways when hunters have used inappropriate bullets and rifles for hunting dangerous game in Africa. Since we're talking buffalo today, and since those creatures are known for their toughness, do you have a similar story that illustrates just how tough Cape buffalo can be?
I do, and it occurred in 2007. I spent 4 months during the hunting season in Kutata 12, which is in Mozambique. And Kutata 12 is just south of the Zambezi River in what is known as the sand forests. It was an interesting time because in 4 months we saw buffalo every day, but not one buffalo looked me in the eye in 4 months. So the buffalo, they were very traumatized. Mainly during the Civil War, the Russians had come in and had shot 80,000 buffalo, and they had the Russian whaling fleet off the mouth of the Zambezi River, and they were just shooting these buffalo from helicopter gunships, and then just cargo slinging the carcasses to these whaling ships to be turned into corned beef for the armies that were fighting. Anyway, and it was quite often because we would see these cannon shells in the middle of the forest. You'd be walking along in these huge big sand forests, and all of a sudden you'd find a 20 millimeter cannon shell, and you couldn't figure out how the heck that cannon shell got there. And they must have just been come out of a helicopter gunship. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the buffalo, they were very spooky, and they were absolutely huge, enormous animals. Their tracks, their tracks were the size of a toilet seat almost. So I had my client was a guy from Washington State, very nice man. And we were just tracking a lone old Duggar boy. This was in July, and it had rained a couple of days before, and the grass was still green and tall. And we were actually following the tracks of this bull through grass that was tall as our heads. It was actually rather a hair-raising experience. In that area, they have got very large termite mounds. They're almost the size of half a basketball court. And on these termite mounds grow big trees, and the tracks of this particular bull skirted around one of these big termite mounds. So I got the tracker just to climb onto the mound, just to look ahead. And as he got to the top, he crouched down, and you could see pointed with his eyes. And the buffalo, it turned out, was lying just on the other side of of the mound underneath a tree. So we crept up onto this termite mound, and you could see the buffalo. He was facing away from us, lying down, facing away from us behind the tree, but there was a fork in the tree, and you could see his spine in the shoulder region through this fork in the tree. And the buffalo was only about 7 or 8 yards in front of us. We were really close to it. And I said to my client, just shoot him there in the spine through the fork of the tree. But my client, he was not mentally prepared for the occasion. I think the mere fact that the buffalo was so close to him, and he was just not ready for it. And the buffalo eventually just sensed us, and 1 minute it was lying down peacefully chewing the cud, and the next minute it was up and in full gallop sprinting away. And I shouted to my client, "Dogs!" And before I could say shoot, he pulled a shot off at this rapidly disappearing buffalo. And then the buffalo just disappeared into this head-high grass. And all I saw was a black shape, and I was totally unprepared for it. But I managed to snap a shot off with my 505 as it had this dark shape. I just snapshot it almost just like a quick shooting a quail going away shot.
Mm-hmm.
So my 505, up until now, I've carried my 505 for nearly 20 years at that stage, and I'd never had to fire more than 2 shots at any animal with it. That's on a Magnum Mauser action, and normally I'll just put 3. The magazine takes 3 cartridges, so I normally would just put 3 cartridges into the magazine and then chamber around. So I had 3 shots. But something just made me think otherwise. And for the first time I ever did it, I chambered a cartridge, and then I turned my rifle upside down, and I opened the magazine, and I put another 3 cartridges into the magazine. So I had 4 shots. And then we waited for half an hour, and then we took up the tracks of this obviously very lightly wounded buffalo, because there was a little bit of blood in. But that grass was taller than our heads, and it was the most nerve-wracking experience. And eventually we tracked it for a while, and then eventually the track skirted around another of these big termite mounds. So my client and I, we climbed on top of the termite mound, and in front of us was just an absolute sea of grass. As far as you could see, a sea of head-high grass. And while we were watching it, I saw the grass move, and I suddenly saw the tip of that buffalo's horn, and he was actually waiting in the grass for us. So my client and I just both started shooting blindly into the grass, roughly where we thought the buffalo was. And he was shooting a 4.58 lot, and he also had 4 shots in his magazine. And because the recoil of the 4.58 lot was probably not as great as my 5.05, he shot off his 4 shots. Just as I was finishing fired my 3rd shot, he shouted to me, "I'm out." And so I knew that I fired 3 shots, and I knew I had only 1 shot left. And as I chambered my 4th cartridge, the buffalo charged us. And luckily, the grass on top of the termite mounds is more nutritious than the rest of the grass, because the termite mounds have better mineral content. Mm-hmm. And that grass is normally grazed a little bit shorter than the grass. We could see the grass parting as the buffalo was coming towards us. And as he emerged out of the long grass, started to come up the termite mound, I shot him through between the shoulder blades on the hump of his neck, and luckily he dropped right there. But we ended up shooting that buffalo 11 times. And it turned out afterwards that on his vital triangle area, where there were 5 shots through his vital triangle, I put my hand, I could cover all 5 bullet holes with my one hand. And yet that had made no difference to that buffalo whatsoever. He came for us like nothing was wrong with him. And it turned out my initial shot had actually hit his left kidney, and it scrambled his kidney. So, and a kidney is a very fatal shot. It hits something in the kidney, and the kidney gets a large amount of blood after the brain. The kidneys get the next most amount of blood in the body. So his one kidney was absolutely scrambled. And he'd had 5 shots through his heart-lung area, and he still charged us, which is just... And to this day, now, I would often think back on that incident, that what would have happened if I'd only loaded 3 cartridges in my rifle? It was just an absolute eye-opening experience. And I don't really know why I did it. I just suddenly decided to do it. Something just sort of forewarned me that maybe I need to put 4 shots into this. And thank God that I did, because I think he would have definitely got to us if I hadn't have done that. And both my client and I was standing with empty rifles. So
my goodness.
It was a real eye.
Ooh, geez. So you said 11 hits, 5 through the vital triangle, 1 that hit the kidneys, and then 1 more that you shot from down top through his spine that put him down. So 7 really good hits on him?
Yeah, 7 times.
Ooh.
And there was also a very famous incident in Zimbabwe when I was a PhD. There was the story went round of an American client who had shot a buffalo 14 times with a 460 Weatherby. And the joke was that they reckoned at the end of the 14 shots, the client looked worse than the buffalo. He was he's hemorrhaging from his nose and both his ears, and the next day he developed 2 massive black eyes like he'd had a fight with old Mike Tyson. I mean, you shoot 14 shots in quick succession of the 460 Weatherby, and that's bound to hurt. But the saying with the buffalo goes, if the first shot doesn't do what it's supposed to do, the next half a dozen just cause a buffalo a minor irritation, and that's very true. I mean, when we cut open that buffalo, that Mozambique buffalo, I mean, his heart lung area was shredded, and yet he's still charged with determination. So truly amazing animals, and I think that's what just makes them so special. You say buffalo, when you start messing with the buffalo, one of you's going to die, and I think that's where the appeal comes in, is that element of what is definitely a dangerous animal, and that's you're putting your own life at risk for an animal's life, and that's what makes them such worthy opponents, in my opinion.
No, I definitely agree. So why don't we rewind a little bit, and why don't you tell us how you first got interested in hunting buffalo? How did your relationship with these animals get started?
Well, that's also an interesting story, because they say you get thrown in the deep end, and that's exactly what happened to me. So I grew up from a medical family. My father was a dentist, and I grew up on the coast, and I used to surf. But I always had a fascination of guns and hunting, and I used to love reading Guns and Ammo magazine, and I used to read all that Elmer Keith and Jack O'Connor and Warren Page, all those American gun writers. I was very familiar with their works. But I always wanted to be in the outdoors, so I studied 2 years of agriculture at Maritzburg University, Maritzburg in Natal, and then I got the opportunity to be accepted into Onderstepoort to do veterinary science. This was in the 1970s, and it was the stage of the height of the American, after the Zimbabwe Bush War, the terrorist war. And in those days, the farmers fought the war, so the farmers would go 6 weeks in and 6 weeks out, and then when the farmer was fighting off in the army, the wives would stay on the farm to look after the farm and keep the farms running. But as the war hotted up into the middle of the 1970s, it became too dangerous for the women to remain alone on the farm. So they would go into town when their husbands went into the army, and then those farms were basically unprotected. There was nobody on the farms. So when I was at Maritzburg University, my first year, the Rhodesian security forces came around to recruit agricultural students who wanted to go and be farm guards. So you would go to the farm for your vacation, your July and December vacation, and then you would be on the farm while the farmer went into the army. I always liked to be a little bit like the dangerous thing. I'd done a year of national service myself, so I accepted that challenge, and I used to go to Zimbabwe, or it was with the still Rhodesia in those days, and guard farms for my university vacations. And that's how I eventually met my lovely wife, and her parents owned 5 farms. I always joke, I said it took me a long time to find a Rhodesian farmer that had 4 daughters and 5 farms. And I eventually, so then I got into veterinary school, and I qualified as a veterinarian in 1981, which was just after Zimbabwe independence. And by that stage, my future parents-in-law said to me, they had 5 farms and 2,500 head of cattle, and they said, come up and you marry our daughter, you come and we'll make you director of the company. You can live on one of the farms, and you can manage our cattle. Well, that's what I did. So Kat and I got married on Lake Kariba soon after I qualified, and this was in 1981, and we moved on to a ranch outside the town of Karoi, which is the last of the town before Lake Kariba in the Zambezi Valley. And then, so we had 1,000 cows, so there were 40 bulls, and the ranch that we lived on, and which I eventually bought from our parents-in-law, housed all the bulls. And we used to make our African laborers wear bright red, pillarbox red overalls so that we could see them when they were walking around in the veld. And I had this one African, I used to nickname him Lightning because he was the exact opposite of the saying, as fast as greased lightning. His actual name was Kalunga, and he used to amble along like he had arthritis, and it used to irritate the hell out of me because I like to see guys walking with a bit of enthusiasm when they were tasked with the job. Anyway, I sent him to go and check on the bulls. And about an hour later, he came back and he was in a very state of affairs. His overall was torn and he had a big scratch on his leg. And in Shona, he said to me, bas, lapa nakona sata nombi, which means there's a devil bovine. And he then imitated with his arms how the horns look. He curled his arms over his head and he snorted and pretended to imitate a charging buffalo. And they said, lo, bas, lo, nyati nakona blalamina, wants to kill me. So I was because this was in the export catchment area. So when we just backtrack a little bit. So Zimbabwe in the early 1980s, when Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, as a form of international aid, the European Economic Union, the EU, gave Zimbabwe the right to export 8,100 tons of deboned hindquarter to the Smithfield market in London. That was deboned, corn-finished beef. And the whole country, because there are buffalo in the Zambezi Valley and all the buffalo are carriers of hoof and mouth disease, the whole of the Zambezi Valley was fenced off with a buffalo-proof fence. And then that was the red zone. And then there was what they call the quarantine zone, where there were no cattle allowed to be. And then there was the commercial farming area. And this farm that Kath and I were staying on was in the beef export catchment area. And 80% of buffalo in Zimbabwe are carriers of foot and mouth disease. So when he told me that there was a buffalo in amongst the bulls, my immediate reaction was to go and see it. And if it was, I just was going to shoot it because I was very worried. Because if we had an outbreak of hoof and mouth disease, that would be the end of our exports. And the cattle industry was just booming. The prices had quadrupled. Everybody was making money out of their cattle. So I jumped on my motorbike, and all I had was an old 303 Lee Metford from the Anglo-Boer War. It had a front sight was wobbly, and the stock was broken and bound up with copper wire. And I rode down, and sure enough, in amongst the bulls, there was a buffalo cow standing there. So I, without hesitation, I shot it. 5 shots with that old 303, managed to kill it with the first shot. Anyway, I took the head off and I sent the head into Harare to the veterinary research laboratory with a note saying that this buffalo had been shot in the export catchment area, and didn't hear anything on it until about a week later. It was in the middle of the night. The phone went. In those days, we had those old party phone lines. And I answered the phone, and whoever was on the other end sounded miles away, and it turned out to be Dr. Stuart Hargreaves. He was the director of veterinary services. And I said, and he was phoning me from Perthbright, because Perthbright is the world reference laboratory for hoof and mouth disease. It's in the UK. And he was phoning from a back room, and he wasn't speaking very loud. He said, I've just got the results, and I'm phoning to tell you that cow that you shot that tested positive for all 3 strains of hoof and mouth disease. It's SAT, Southern African Territory. So there are 3 different strains of hoof and mouth disease in Southern Africa, and that buffalo was positive for all 3 strains.
Oh, my.
And he said to me there over the phone, he said, listen, if this gets out that you shot a foot and mouth positive buffalo in the beef export catchment area, that'll be the end of our exports. And he said, you just keep quiet about it. You get hold of the farmers and you just tell them that if there's any buffalo coming to that area, they notify you, and I'm personally ordering you. That's your responsibility to go get rid of every buffalo that comes into the farming areas. So my very first animal that I ever killed or ever hunted was a buffalo. And over the next 20 years, we must have shot about 100 buffalo coming into our area. And for some reason, they were all cows. Not one of them was pregnant, and they all had corpus luteums on their ovaries. So I subsequently found out it's called gene dispersal. These cows just go walkabout. For some reason, they would leave the confines of Mana Pools, which was not too far away, or the hunting area of the Zambezi Valley, somehow get through that buffalo-proof fence, and then just come wandering into the commercial farming area. And then for all lightning, I used to dip cattle on a different farm every day, and I used to take my herdsman with me. And about a week later, after this incident, I was on one of my brother-in-law's farms dipping the cattle there, and some of the cattle were missing. Then I sent old Kulunga off to go and look for them, and he walked, and there was a big termite mound, and he saw what he thought was one of my cattle standing on the termite mound, and he shouted at it, and it didn't move. So he threw a stone at it, and it got chased by a second buffalo. So the poor guy, within 2 weeks, he got chased by 2 buffalo, and then eventually he just said, no, bugger, he's not going to be a cattleman anymore. It's too damn dangerous. He wanted to become the gardener because it was too dangerous for him to be walking around. So eventually, we shot so many that used to come in that area that I eventually stopped testing them. Everyone that we tested was positive. And that's because every buffalo over 2 years old is a carrier of foot and mouth. They say 80% of the buffalo are foot and mouth carriers. That's basically what it means is 80% of the buffalo are 2 years or older, or older than 2 years old. Because the buffalo are born free of hoof and mouth disease, and then they get their colostral immunity when they drink their first feeding is that colostrum, that butter-rich milk. And that basically vaccinates them for the first 6 or 7 months of their lifetime. Then they pick up, when they lose their colostral immunity, they pick up the virus which is circulated in the herd, and then they go through a viremic state, which means they have the virus in their blood, so they develop antibodies against that virus. And those antibodies push the virus into the squamous cell epithelium of the throat. That's the lining of the throat where they sort of say, so the antibodies can't get them, and that buffalo is then considered a carrier. And every buffalo older 2 years old is a carrier of hoof and mouth disease.
So is this a case where the hoof and mouth doesn't really hurt the buffalo, but will it hurt a person if you eat a Cape buffalo that was carrying hoof and mouth?
It's not a zoonosis. It doesn't affect humans, but it is. Hoof and mouth disease is one of the most contagious diseases known to man, and it's a disease that is known to change governments and cause economies to collapse and things like that. So it's a very nasty disease. I mean, if they have an outbreak of foot and mouth in South Africa, they stop exporting table grapes from Cape Town, that type of thing. It's just a disease that nobody wants because it is, once you get it, it's very hard to control it, especially in Europe where they have lots of awful weather, lots of, no sunshine and lots of rain and fog and mist, because it's a virus, and the virus is killed by either drying out, we call that desiccation, or it's killed by ultraviolet light. So Africa has got masses of viral diseases, but with a relatively dry climate and lots of sunshine, those diseases are easier to control, as opposed to in Europe where they have this awful weather and then you just cannot control the disease. I mean, hoof and mouth actually blew across the English Channel in a fog once. So they had an outbreak in France and eventually just blew across the Channel and they had an outbreak in England. So they're paranoid about it. And just an add-on to that, in the middle 1990s, I mean, the exports went well for a long time, and Zimbabwe was free of foot and mouth until, I think in the middle 1990s, there was a consignment of beef was on a ship, because the beef used to get railed to Cape Town because it was chilled, deboned hindquarters, so it was very good quality meat, and they would put it on a refrigerated ship at Cape Town Harbour and go take it by sea to Southampton in London. And when the ship was on the equator, near the equator somewhere, there was an outbreak of hoof and mouth in Zimbabwe, but that occurred in the Lowveld from the Wankie side, the other side of the country. And they opened the doors of those fridges and they chucked 8,000 tons of beef into the sea. And that the Zimbabwean cattle industry collapsed within 24 hours. The cattle industry collapsed.
My goodness.
So that's how I got into game, and I got into hunting and all the other parts of my life. But it was basically just being thrown in the deep end, just to protecting the Zimbabwe's cattle industry, that I got involved with hunting. And as I'm sure you know, once you've hunted one buffalo, it's a bit like getting HIV. Once you've got it, you've got it. I've been involved in the safari business for almost 30 years now, and I've never met a client that said, okay, I've hunted a buffalo, that's it, I'm done. Clients will come and they'll shoot a good sable and a good roan and a lion and a leopard and all that, but one thing that they'll come back for time and time again is a buffalo. I mean, nobody goes and shoots 100 kudu, but I mean, someone will go and shoot 100 buffalo in his lifetime for sure. It's just that attraction.
Yeah, if I had the money, I darn sure would be doing that.
Yeah, no, it's so I hope that answers that part of the question. So I was just got thrown into the deep end, and then I just became absolutely fascinated by them from there. And then since then, they just become my absolute fascination. Ended up writing that little book in Yati about them. Then I've also written a more comprehensive book called Africa's Most Dangerous, which is just almost my thesis on buffalo.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about buffalo, like where they live and, a little bit about their natural history, that sort of thing.
Okay, buffalo are just basically, they're bovines, they're ruminants, they're classified as a bulk grazer. So they've got this big, hard, rubbery mouth. So they can't really select. They just select their feed. They're just a bulk grazer. In order to survive, buffalo need four things. They need shade, they need water, they need grass, and they need mud. That's their basic survival. Also, they occur in areas which are mostly inhabited, were inhabited by the tsetse fly. And the tsetse fly is a nasty little creature that transmits the disease called sleeping sickness. They were Ngana to cattle. So wherever there were tsetse flies, human habitation was not there because people couldn't live without their donkeys and their dogs and their goats and sheep and all that. And those are all very susceptible to the bites of tsetse flies and the disease called Ngana. When the Africa was settled in the colonial times, the settlers all went to the more hospitable climates where it was higher and cooler and there were no tsetse flies because the tsetse fly cannot survive over 1,200 meters of altitude. So the higher areas, and that's where the better rainfall was. So like in Rhodesia, for example, all the better parts of the country were colonized for growing crops and ranching cattle. But the Zambezi Valley and all the low-lying areas was where there were tsetse flies, and that's because there were tsetse flies. There were basically no people living there, so that's where the game thrived. So there are 5 different types of buffalo. There's what we call the Cape, what is known as the Cape buffalo. That is probably a bit of a name. Its proper name should be the southern buffalo because that occurs in South Africa and Botswana and Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and it goes up into Tanzania and Kenya. Then you have, in the tropical rainforest, you have the dwarf forest buffalo. Then you have the Nile buffalo, which occur in the Nile system. Then you have the western savanna buffalo, which are also up north in Africa. But by far the most common, the largest distribution of buffalo is what we know as the southern buffalo or the Cape buffalo. And those are the ones that are hunted most regularly as part of the big 5. Buffalo is just basically a walking stomach. I mean, the grass he eats is not all that nutritious, and it takes an enormous amount of grass to fill up a buffalo's stomach. So a buffalo's stomach is basically the size of a 44-gallon oil drum. It's about 200 liters capacity, and it sits on the left-hand side of the animal. And what you don't want to do, so that's one big thing I see when you talk about the anatomical features. You never take an initial shot at a buffalo if it's quartering away from his left-hand side, because that bullet will have to penetrate through 3 or 4 feet of very densely packed grassy material. And quite often, if the bullet's too light and it's already expanded, quite often it stops in the rumen. When we hunt buffalo, they've always said the first shot should always be with an expanding type bullet, and then your backing shot should be with either a solid or a cup-nose solid. And the reason for that is that invariably the buffalo's running away from you after your first shot, and very often you get a left-hand side quartering away shot. And if you get to the heart-lung area, that means you have to shoot through the rumen, and very often a soft-point bullet doesn't get to the rumen, especially if it's fully expanded. So we recommend the first shot always with a soft point, so that makes a nice big permanent wound channel, and then the second and third shot, if there's time for them, is with a solid, so that they can penetrate the full body length of a buffalo if it's running away from you. So that answers that question.
So buffalo are known for having kind of a poor disposition, right? Ill-tempered, and for being really tough. Why? Can you tell us a little bit about buffalo behavior and how you think they've developed that sort of reputation?
Well, they are just always grumpy. I'm sure they all just wake up with a hangover every morning or a headache every morning. But there's another reason. I've got a theory, and it's very difficult to prove, that I believe it contributes to the toughness of all African game animals, but buffalo in particular. In late 1890s, there was a disease outbreak in the top of Africa known as the rinderpest. And the rinderpest is a viral disease which is endemic to Asia. And this disease has always been associated with war or conflict of some kind. And it's speculated that when Genghis Khan invaded Europe in the 1200s, he brought the rinderpest with him, because in those days, when armies invaded, they had bullock carts which pulled their equipment, and they also had herds of cattle which would use to feed the armies. During the Napoleonic Wars, much of Europe was devastated by the rinderpest as well, and that was also associated with the whole Napoleon and the French moving cattle around and stuff. Anyway, this disease got to Africa, and it broke out in 1890, and there are three possible reasons. Lord Kitchener was in Khartoum with the British, the Germans were in Tanganyika, and the Italians were in Eritrea, and that's where it broke out. And this was a new disease, so rinderpest is a disease of cloven-hoofed animals. So every animal with a cloven hoof, that's from a giraffe down to a little duiker, was susceptible to this disease. And over the subsequent 8 years, the disease lurched its way through the length and breadth of the African continent, killing an estimated 90% of the cloven-hoofed animals in Africa. So there's very little recorded history of those times. The best is from the writings of Frederick Corte Selous. He talks about the avenging angels sweeping down from the north, and he describes what the conditions were like in Matabeleland where he was, where he estimated that 500,000 head of cattle, domestic cattle, died as a result of the rinderpest. It was a very interesting time for me because it was also the start of veterinary science. So Arnold Tyler, the guy that started the veterinary school where I qualified as a vet, he was a Swiss veterinarian. He was brought to Africa by Paul Kruger, who was the president of the Transvaal, to try and diagnose what the disease was. In those days, there was only one veterinary officer, a guy by the name of Charles Gray. He was the colonial veterinary officer in the Cape Colony. And then these two vets traveled to Matabele, and they were the first to diagnose that this was the rinderpest. And I'm sure it contributed to the Anglo-Boer War. Wars were fought over it. But what I believe, how that changed in Africa is that the predators, that's the lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, all have a short gestation period, and they respond to times of plenty. So it's well known in the drought years when all the other animals are having a hard time, the predators do really well. And I believe as this rinderpest was lurching its way through Africa, killing animals in untold millions of numbers, I believe it was followed by what must have been a predator population explosion. So the predators would have bred quickly because there was just so much food for them. They didn't have to hunt. There were just carcasses everywhere. But then there must have been a fine-tuning period, because after the disease had passed on, only 10% of the animals remained. And I believe they were subjected to a massive amount of predator pressure. So in any population, there's always some percentage of the population is naturally immune or by chance don't get infected. So they estimate that 10% of wild animals in Africa survived the disease. But then I believe that they were subjected to a massive amount of predator pressure from what must have been hundreds of predators who in themselves would have died then off quite quickly if they'd run out of food. So the descendants, every buffalo walking around alive today is a descendant from those buffalo that survived the disease and then survived what I believe was this massive amount of predator pressure. It's also quite interesting, if you follow the writings of Africa, when those predators, when they didn't have anything to eat, they turned to another form of protein, and that was Homo sapiens. I've just finished watching that movie, The Ghost in the Darkness, about the man-eaters of Tsavo. Mm-hmm. And what is the coincidence? And I've actually seen the Tsavo lions that they're in the Field Museum in Chicago. That whole incident occurred 2 years after the rinderpest had passed through. So I'm pretty sure there's a connection between man-eaters and the rinderpest. But I also believe that the buffalo, I mean, if you've seen a buffalo, lions attack a buffalo and you think, well, he's just about done. And sometimes then a light seems to go on in the buffalo's head, and next minute he's jumping up and he's fighting back. And I think that's that instinct, that's the survival instinct that a buffalo's got, and that's just what makes him so darn tough. I also think he just produces adrenaline by the bucket load, because when you take another animal with its heart shredded, it just sort of dies pretty quickly. But a buffalo just seems to be different. He's built like a Sherman tank. The late Dr. Don Heath was a friend of mine, and he told me that once on a routine culling operation in the Gonera Zoo, he cut open an old buffalo bull's heart, and in the medial septum of the heart, that's between the left and the right ventricle, there was a calloused 303 bullet was in the buffalo's heart. And that been calloused there, it must have been there for years. And that buffalo survived with a 303 bullet in his heart. So they're just different. I mean, they seem to have just a bad attitude. You know, and my last experience, well, the most recent buffalo I had to shoot in self-defense occurred in 2016 when I was at the Southern African Wildlife College, and we had PH students on an 18-month PH course, and these students were just finishing up their training, and we were allowing them to do practice hunts. So one student would be the tracker, one student would be the PH, and one student would be the client. And then we had a laser torch in a old piece of water pipe that was put into the stock of a Bruno rifle, and we put sights on it. So when you wanted to take a shot, you would actually just push a button, and this laser would shine about 200 meters, even in bright African sunlight. So then I would then photograph. So when the student would take the shot, I would just then photograph the animal with wherever the green dot was as proof of a kill. And on this particular occasion, it was in November. It was after the drought, and we found the tracks of a lone Duggar boy, which the tracker tracked, and then we caught up to him pretty quickly. He was walking on an elephant path. So the PH then took the client in for the stalk, and we got to about 50 meters from the buffalo, and the buffalo then sensed them, turned around and looked at them, and the client put the rifle on the sticks, and he said, the PH said he could shoot, and as the shot, there was suddenly a little green dot appeared on the buffalo's chest, and I quickly took a photograph of it, and at that moment, that buffalo just said, "Don't point that at me," and he just charged us, totally unprovoked. He just came for us. But he came for us in a sort of, he was a little bit wobbly in his back legs, and it turned out after that he'd been bitten more by lions than lions had bitten him on either side of his spine, and had these nasty punch wounds full of maggots. And he came, we tried to shout him down, and it didn't work, so we just stood our ground, and we backed up into a bush, and then I shot him at 5 paces with my 505. But that was just, he was just sore and angry, and when we reported it to the ranger, and he eventually just said, this buffalo attacked a car the day before and messed up one of the tourist cars. So, I mean, you just like that, just charge you for no reason.
Kind of got a bad attitude anyway, yeah. And then he's injured and in pain, and he's even more ornery than usual. So yeah, that's not really surprising behavior.
When you talk on the behavior of animals, all animals have an imaginary 3 circles around them. The outer circle is what we call the safe zone. The animal says, I can see you, and you're far enough away from me that you don't pose a threat to me. I'm quite happy just to stand and look at you. And as you walk toward that animal starts to feel uncomfortable that his space is being threatened, and then he starts to move. And we call that the escape zone. He moves until he feels safe again, back in the safe zone. The inner circle around the animal is what we call the attack zone. And buffalo are particularly notorious because buffalo they age like humans do. They get cataracts in their eyes. They have tick infestations in the ear canals. So eventually their ear canals get calloused and close over. They get arthritis. They get in their hip joints, so they become grumpy old men. And if you happen to be, and because they start losing their hair, so they often go and lie in some thick shade. And if you happen to walk up onto a buffalo like that, especially if you're walking into the wind, so the buffalo doesn't smell you and he doesn't hear you, and that buffalo just suddenly jumps up in front of you. It's very common. That's when they just come for you because that's in their attack zone, and they just don't like people being too close to them. And that's the real danger of if you're just walking in a wilderness area where there are buffalo occurring. So we say to people, just don't go and look for trouble. Don't walk in those areas where a buffalo could be lurking in some reeds or in some in some thick grass, because that's, if you do walk into him and you bump him, he's going to come for you and sort you out.
Yeah, that was a bunch of very interesting information you put out there. I remember you talked about your theory about the rinderpest epidemic in your book, Africa's Most Dangerous. And I thought it was fascinating, and like you said, who knows if it's actually true, but it's a darn good explanation for a lot of things going on in Africa, and who knows, it may well be. And like you said, buffalo are just, they're just tough animals, and like you said, survival of the fittest. That was literally what was going on with them, and that may very well explain what the deal is with buffalo. And if nothing else, it makes for very interesting campfire discussions.
It certainly does. When I lived in Zimbabwe, I lived very close to Mana Pools, which is a very famous game reserve, and there are no restrictions there. You can get out and walk and do your own thing. And quite often people get injured there. And I remember there was a honeymoon couple, because and they wanted to walk down to the river, and there was a donga, and the husband jumped over it, and it was too wide for his newly married wife to jump over. So she stepped down into this donga as a buffalo walked around the corner, and the buffalo just took one look at her and just hooked her and killed her. And we were in monopools at the time. I remember we were trying to help them get the body out and things like that. And that was just wrong place at the wrong time. And normally that had been a kudu or something like that. It would have turned and run away. But she just jumped down in front of this whole Duggar boy who was ambling along, and he just hooked her. And that was one hook was all it took to kill the young lady. Very unfortunate.
My goodness, geez. Oh man. Well, shifting gears a little bit, can you tell us a little bit about Cape Buffalo trophy evaluation? How you would, what makes a good buffalo? What's their characteristics for their horns?
In my opinion, a good buffalo is an old buffalo. I've been on a one-man crusade for the last 30 years to try and get Safari Club International to change their buffalo scoring method. Let me just back up a little bit. The buffalo are basically sexually mature in their 5th year. So all animals become sexually mature when they attain 2/3 of their genetically determined body weight. So sexual maturity is a function of weight, not age. So how fast the animal grows determines how quickly he gets to that weight, determines when he goes through the significant hormonal changes in his life. So buffalo sexually mature starts when he is in his 5th year, but he has to wait until his boss, that's the hard, bony bit or hard, horny bit on top of his forehead, is solid enough to withstand the pounding it takes when they fight for the right to be socially dominant. So no buffalo gets to mate with a buffalo cow until he's first had to fight and win a fight for social dominance. So if you know that if you want to become reproductively successful, you have to win a fight. If you're a human, you'd go to the gym and start working out to make sure that you win that fight. So how does the buffalo work out? What he does, as his boss is developing, and he starts fighting with trees and bushes. He'll take a small tree or a bush, and he fights it like the devil's after him. And what he's doing that fighting, he's developing his neck and his shoulder muscle for that confrontation that's going to occur. But while he's horn rubbing or fighting a bush, what it does, it also starts to wear down the tips of his horns. So there are 2 different methods of measuring buffalo. The one is what we call the Roland Ward method. That's the old British method, and that's just the straight outside greatest width. It's got nothing to do with the horn tips. It's just how the wider the buffalo, the better it scores. When a buffalo looks at you with his ears alert, and if his ear tips are in good condition, they often get torn and ragged when the bull gets older. And alert buffalo ears, when the ears are pricked and lurched, the distance between those ear tips is between 31 and 33 inches. We normally say it's about 32 inches. And when we hunt in Africa, we talk in hands. Your hand is 6 inches long and 4 inches wide. So if your buffalo is looking at you, and you can imagine you can put one hand span on either side of his alert ear tips. If the horn spread is greater than that, that's a 40-inch buffalo. And that's the magic figure. Everybody wants to shoot a buffalo that's 40 inches or bigger. With some buffalo, you can put 2 hands on either side of his ear tips, and then he's in the 46 to the 48-inch bracket. The SCR, the Safari Club International scoring system, measures around the curl. So it measures from the tips all the way around the curl, across the front of the boss, to all around the curl on the other side. So as a buffalo, as he gets older and he starts wearing his horn tips down, and you'll often see old Duggar boys with they're broomed off, their horns are very blunt or sometimes even broken. They score less and less. So if you go into the record book of SCI and you look at the highest scoring buffalo there, all those buffalo were shot, in my opinion, before they'd even had a chance to breed. And that is not sustainable. You know, we all know that hunting is a very important part of conservation. But hunting needs to stand on 4 pillars. It's got to be socially acceptable, which is having a hard time now because people think it's unethical to hunt. It's got to be financially sustainable. It's got to be ecologically sustainable, and it's also got to be genetically sustainable. And we know for a fact now that in the breeding of buffalo, if you take a 50-inch buffalo bull and you mate it with a 30-inch buffalo cow, by what is known as the quantitative additive state, the average size of the offspring of that mating will be 40 inches. So you take add the two measurements together, divide it in half. There's a 70% chance that if you mate a 50-inch buffalo cow with a 30-inch buffalo bull, there's a 70% chance that the resulting horn spread of the progeny will be 40 inches, with a 15% better than average and a 15% less than average. So if you keep on going, shooting all the best bulls before they've had an opportunity to breed, it's only logical that eventually you're eliminating those genes out of the population. And eventually the poorer quality bulls breed, and then by the same quantitative additive state, the trophy quality just decreases. So this is a research project I did when I was at the Southern African Wildlife College. Next to the Kruger National Park, which is South Africa's very famous game reserve, are 4 privately owned nature reserves, the Umbabat, Timavati, Klaseri, and Bululi. And they have very well-regulated hunting operations there, which pays for the running costs of the reserves and also mainly to keep the anti-poaching, keep their rhinos alive. So what we did, and before they work out the quota for each hunting season, the buffalo in those reserves are all individually counted. And they used to count them with a helicopter, but they found that the helicopter was just too noisy and the buffalo didn't like it. Now they've got these, what they call light sport aircraft, these little Kit Foxes and sort of light sport aircraft with Rotax engines, which are very silent. And with a very good quality camera, they were found that if you flew over these herds, and you can just photograph the herds with this good quality camera, and they've got the technology now that stitches the photographs together, you can actually get a really good count of the buffalo in each area. And then I've been doing work on aging of buffalo and when they heard of my method and how I was getting had a system of how to look at a buffalo and determine its age, they gave me these photographs to say, listen, can't you do anything with these photographs? And the quality of the photographs was so good that you could actually see oxpeckers on the buffalo. And so I initiated a research project where we photographed all the buffalo in the APNR, and then I got 2 students from Oxford University, and then we were teaching artificial intelligence computers to age and to trophy assess the buffalo. So first of all, we did, and for the first time ever, we looked at the size of the buffalo cows in the population. Nobody had ever done a survey to see how big, what is the average size of the buffalo cows in the Kruger National Park, for example. Nobody knew that figure, and we finally got it out. So when to train the computer, we would determine if it was a male or a female. And then if it was a male, we just looked at the sexually mature males, and we divided the bulls into a bull that's sexually mature, that's 5 to 7 years old, and then a bull breeding bull was 8 to 11, and then 12 years and older was a post-breeding age Duggar boy. And then we divided the trophy size into less than 30 inches, or then low 30s, which was from 30 to 33 inches spread, and then mid 30s was 34 to 37, and then 36, and then 37 to 39 was high 30s, and low 40s, mid 40s, high 40s. And we did this complete survey, and we actually put 14,000 buffalo into the computer. And what it was, we would find a herd and fly around it and photograph it at all the different angles, because the buffalo needed to be looking at you to be able to judge the width and the ear pitch. So we'd also have a little siren on the airplane, and it'd make a noise, and the buffalo would look up at the airplane, and then we could photograph them like that. And then we took that information and we compared it to the survey of the buffalo in the Kruger National Park, which is the same. It's the same population. It's the same. There's no fences in between. It's just some buffalo live in the hunting areas and some buffalo live in the non-hunting areas. And we compared the 2 populations, and that work really set the alarm bells ringing. Because basically all the good buffalo are gone. They used to be there, but they were just being hunted out. And so as it now stands, with the technology that we've got, we can work out what is the average trophy size of a population. And the recommendations these days are that if you want to hunt a buffalo that's better than the average of the population, he must be 12 years old or older. So he's had every opportunity to pass his better than average genes on. And then Napa buffalo is less than that with the population average. You want to get rid of him before he breeds. So you'd have him sell him as a management hunt or a management bull, and you'd hunt him as soon as he's 8 years old, until his boss is just hard enough to make a nice trophy, but he hasn't had the opportunity to breed yet. So that's the recommendation. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I had no idea what you were talking about with that research project. That is very interesting. I've heard of the of the hunting, particularly in the Klasiri, and I've seen how they do have that management buffalo that they've offered, and he is the cheapest one that they do offer. It's not cheap, but it is relatively less expensive than the other ones, and it is definitely, like you said, within that very strict size constraints to fit into each one. Like I said, just absolutely fascinating what you're talking about. And so if you were king of the world and you could change the SCI method right now to incentivize what you're talking about, how would you do it?
Well, I still think it's not that widespread, but there needs to be more emphasis on the boss. So I would believe you take the Roland Ward method, which is the greatest spread, and you add to that the over-the-top measurement of each boss in inches. So you just have, you have spread with, the SCR method is when you measure the boss, you use a caliper. So it's not, it's just a straight line length. It's not over the top length. Sometimes we get these buffalo that look like they've got two cannonballs on their heads, and they've got these massive big bosses. And you need to have some sort of recognition for that. So my suggestion would be the Roland Ward straight line greatest outside spread width, plus the over the top width of each boss in inches, and then just make that as one total. So you did like a 40-inch spread with 20-inch bosses. That bull will be 80-inch, would have you an 80-inch buffalo, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely understand what you're talking about. And sorry, go ahead.
There's got to be. I get it on social media all the time. These people posting pictures of these really beautiful bulls that are shot in their prime, and it's just public awareness. People just got to realize that that's just not sustainable anymore. We know now that the buffalo is most active from being able to aid these buffalo and living in the Kruger Park for 4 years. We see which buffalo do the work, and the buffalo, he's from his late in his 8th year until late in his 11th year. That's when he's an active breeding bull. Also, being a herd bull for a buffalo is very stressful and very difficult. First of all, they always graze at the back of the herd, because when the buffalo herd is grazing, they graze zigzag into and across the wind, because the wind tells them of if there's any predators up ahead. The bulls are always, and when the lions attack the buffalo herd, the lions attack from the rear. So the buffalo graze at the back of the herd, which means they're grazing on grass that's already been trampled by the herd members in front of them. They also spend a lot of their time guarding and fending off different challenges. And I had a very good example of this. Kat, my wife, and I, we went and had a barbecue at one of the dams in the Kruger Park, and there was a buffalo herd who was lying there in the mud, wallowing and just ruminating. So buffalo needs to ruminate for 8 hours a day. It needs to chew the cud for 8 hours a day, and he either does that standing or lying down. He cannot walk and ruminate. He's either got to stand and ruminate, or he's got to lie down. And we watched that buffalo herd for 5 hours, and there were two herd bulls. It wasn't a particularly big herd, but there were two dominant herd bulls in that herd, and they did not stop walking for 5 hours. They just walk round and round this herd. They were on guard duty, because that's when the buffalo lying down, that's when they're vulnerable to attack by lions. So when the buffalo's a herd bull, the quality of his food decreases, and he doesn't get enough time to just lie down and chew the cud. So he quickly starts losing body condition. And when he loses body condition, he gets challenged for that really privileged position. And if he loses that challenging fight, he then leaves the herd, and he goes and joins up with some bachelor herd, where they watch rugby and drink beer and just talk boys talk. Mm-hmm. And that's a very important time for that bull now to regain the body condition he lost when he was a dominant herd bull. And then he'll re-challenge to get that position back into the herd again. So we have this continual movement of bulls in and out of the herds. And the people say, I shot this old Duggar boy because he was with a bachelor group. But he said, no, it might be he was with the bachelor group, but that bull is still of breeding age. He's just on R&R. So during his 3-year, 10-year period when he's of breeding age, he might join and leave half a dozen herds in his lifetime. And a lot of people are under the misconception. They make this excuse, I shot this bull in the bachelor herd, that's why he's got to be a Duggar boy. we can now age bulls so accurately that we can say, no, that bull was only 8.5 years old. He's only going to turn 9 in February next year. So there's this method that we use where we take the first molar tooth, that is the third tooth from the bottom jaw on each side, and we measure with a caliper the crown height. That's the enamel or part of the tooth in 4 places on each corner of it. That gives us 8 measurements. We plot that on a graph, and that gives us the buffalo's age in years. This work was done by a guy called Dr. Russell Taylor when he did his doctoral thesis in Rhodesia. So then we take the teeth tells us that buffalo is 8 years old. Then we look for the other characteristics that will also show tell us that buffalo is 8. And we look at how solid the boss is, how sharp the horn tips are, and what is also very characteristic is as a buffalo gets older, he develops what we call a chin lap. He gets a little fold of skin underneath his chin, and that is also it's also a result of the hormonal influence of testosterone. So we can very accurately age buffalo, and we know that buffalo are born in the second half of the summertime rainy season, which is basically February and March. So we know when the buffalo's birthday is. So we can actually say that buffalo is 10 years old, is going to be 11 in February next year. I mean, that's how accurate we can get with aging. I've done thousands now. I just can just look at a buffalo and continue within a couple of months how old he is, I reckon. And the emphasis now is that if you're going to shoot these really old bulls, they're really spectacular bulls. I believe that they've got it. We should not be allowed to shoot them until they're 12 years old and older. You know, with lion hunting now, you're not allowed to shoot a lion unless he's 6 or older. I forget the exact figure. I believe that we should be starting to put regulations like that in. There's really special bulls, give them the chance to breed, and then also have management bulls. Because there's lots of these really bulls that have got no trophy potential, but some people like yourself would give you eye teeth just to hunt a buffalo. I mean, it doesn't have to be a world record or fantastic buffalo, just the experience of hunting a buffalo. So I think why not hunt these poorer quality bulls for the experience, and also just get those genes out of the way and give the better bulls the opportunity to breed before they get hunted.
And so like you said, shoot one of those bulls when he's 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that.
I would say you should just shoot him when he's in his 9th year, when he's 8th year. You know, so his boss is still nice and hard. So when you can have a skull mount of him, you know, a European mount. Because if that bull is too young and you boil the boss and the boss is not hard, there's no material, then that just gets boiled away. And I often look at the mounts of all these impressive buffalo that I see at all the safari shows, and you can see that buffalo, the taxidermist has been very liberal with his body, with his putty to make up for the boss that wasn't there. And they try and tell you this is turn a 6-year-old bull into a 10-year-old bull, which just doesn't happen.
So I have a European mount of my buffalo sitting here in my office. Is that something that I could you send me the instructions on how to do the tooth measurement on it? Is that something I could do myself?
Well, it's the bottom jaw.
I don't have the bottom jaw. Okay, no.
Yeah. But send me a picture of the mount, and I'll tell you exactly how old that buffalo was. Okay.
All right. He's got a darn good boss on him and nice worn down tips. So I'm interested to see what you have to say about it when I send you that photo.
I will send you the photo. You obviously got some trophy photos of him when you took the shot as well, didn't you? Well, send me those photos and I'll age him for you. Where did he come from?
Southern Zimbabwe, right on the border with right in that Crook's Corner area with South Africa and Mozambique.
With Gonarzo. All right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, not far from there. Yeah.
All the work that I've done on buffalo is from buffalo south of the Zambezi. So I was approached by one of the Tanzanian professional hunters who told me that I was out in my aging, and he hunted those mountain buffalo. And I said to him, well, I might be out on my aging because your buffalo eat green grass all year round. They grow faster. They probably get sexually mature a year earlier than buffalo south of the Zambezi in the relatively low rainfall area. So maybe I'm out, but I explained to him that this whole thing about sexual maturity is a function of body weight rather than age. So I'm not too familiar with how to age buffalo from in the north of Africa, because I believe those buffalo look a year older than they really are because they just got sexually mature earlier. And we know that buffalo's boss and all that is a function of hormonal influence, because I've got photographs of castrated buffalo that have got no boss. And they just become an ox, and they never develop a boss. They always just grow and grow. And those buffalo have have their testicles bitten off by hyenas when they calves, and they just become an ox. And there've been throughout the history there've been a number of famous buffalo that were definitely males, but they didn't have testicles and they'd never developed a boss. They just got this, the horns just kept on growing. So we know from that fact, we know that a buffalo's boss is very much a secondary sexual characteristic, which is associated with testosterone, which is associated with sexual maturity, which is associated with weight, and all those other factors that make the buffalo look the way we do. So for me, the best buffalo is the oldest buffalo. So I took a client or a friend on a buffalo hunt last year in the Zambezi Valley, and our mission was to go and find the oldest buffalo that we could find. And it was a most fantastic hunt. We looked over 47 different bulls until we found this bull we've just called Bigfoot. And I've just written a story up just been published in Sports the Field, the latest edition of Sports the Field. It's about the hunt for old Bigfoot. And we found this buffalo had one massive big track. So much so that the tracker said there's a giraffe in the Zambezi Valley. Well, there are no giraffe in the Zambezi, but the track was so big.
Huh.
Anyway, we followed this. We followed this bull, and he wasn't putting any weight on that leg the metacarpal bone is broken, and he must have been like that for years because his hoof just grew and grew. Because as buffalo get more massive and more heavier later on in life, their front feet grow to expand in size to compensate for that weight. And also when a buffalo walks, those old bulls, when they walk like they've got all the problems of the world on their shoulders, they drag their front feet. And that continual dragging, wears the front edge of their hooves down. So when we're hunting buffalo, I believe you can actually almost age a buffalo just by looking at his tracks. So we just look for the biggest track that you can find, and if that big track's got a nice squared off front edge, then you know that you've got a really old bull. And I believe ages. And those old bulls, that's when they get the character. They have all the torn ears, and they just look characterful. Young buffalo hasn't developed any character yet when he's too young. He just looks too young and pretty.
How old do you think Bigfoot was when your client shot him?
He was. I said at least 13, and he was 14 and a half. I actually got his front teeth, and we measured it, and we formed that hopefully for the safari show how we measured the teeth, because you also hunted we shot the second buffalo that was lions had been hassling it, and it was just about to fall over. And when he shot it, and that was a 9-year-old bull. And if you can, so I've compared the two bulls together and got their teeth as a comparison between a 9 and a 14-and-a-half-year-old bull.
Ah, interesting.
So, yeah, no buffalo ever makes it to 16 in the Kruger National Park. So by the time a buffalo is in his 15th year, basically he's done. His teeth are just about worn out. And then when his teeth wear out, that's it. He just basically either starves to death, or the lions take a heavy toll of those old buffalo because they become vulnerable when they get older. And that's another thing why I believe those old buffalo become more aggressive as they get older, because they become more vulnerable. They're losing their defensive edge. They don't hear as well. They're slower because of arthritis. Their horn tips are now blunt. And they overcome their vulnerability by aggression, in my opinion. So they become a lot more aggressive as they get older.
Yeah.
We just say they just got shit in their liver. Excuse my French, but that's an African saying. That this old buffalo, he's just got shit in his liver. That's what we used to describe those real grumpy old bulls. And they just definitely become more aggressive as they get older. And I'm sure it's because they are becoming more vulnerable to lions and predation. And the only way they can compensate for being vulnerable is by becoming aggressive.
Well, I think that is a good place to wrap it up today. This has been a fascinating, very interesting discussion. I've really enjoyed having you back on the show. And I've read your books, and I still learned a tremendous amount just from talking to you today. So thank you very much, Kevin.
That's a pleasure. I really enjoyed it myself. And please remember to send me those pictures of your buff, and I'll gladly age him for you with pleasure.
All right, will do. Okay, that was quite the discussion, wasn't it? I hope you learned a lot from that interview and that you found it interesting at the same time. Kevin talked about his theory regarding the rinderpest epidemic and how that might help explain the legendary toughness of African game in general and buffalo in particular in his book, Africa's Most Dangerous. I thought it was a fascinating theory at the time, and I still believe it does a really good job of explaining a lot about African wildlife. Now, if you don't have a copy of that book, then I highly recommend that you pick one up. I purchased a copy of Africa's Most Dangerous many years ago before my first buffalo hunt, and I found it extremely helpful. This book is well written and easy to read, and I've continued to use it as a reference to this day. So if you're planning a buffalo hunt, or if you just want to learn more about Cape Buffalo and want a great all-in-one reference, then you will not be disappointed with Africa's Most Dangerous. And I will put a link in the show notes where you can get your own copy. Now, like we mentioned at the end of the show, I sent photos of the buffalo my dad and I shot in Zimbabwe many years ago for him to age. He estimated that my buffalo was about 9 years old. That buffalo had a gigantic boss, but only about a 37-inch spread. So he actually fit fairly well into the quote-unquote management category that Kevin referenced in the show, since he was well into his breeding window, but didn't have an exceptionally wide spread. Now, I shot that buffalo out of a bachelor herd, and there were a total of about 4 bulls hanging out together, and my PH said that one of the bulls was quite a bit bigger than this one, but that this particular buffalo had one of the biggest bosses he'd ever seen. I told him I wanted the one with the bigger boss, and this buffalo did not disappoint. Now, my dad also shot a buffalo on that same hunt a few days later with a 42-inch spread that Kevin estimated was about 10 years old. So his buffalo was getting towards the end of his breeding window, but was probably still in it. And like my buffalo, this bull was hanging out away from the main herd with another bull. Now, I'll put photos of each buffalo in the show notes for you to check out. Now, Kevin will be back on the show again next week, and we're going to talk about how to prepare for a hunt in Africa, especially for Cape Buffalo. So be sure to check out that episode. Additionally, if you've always dreamed of hunting Cape Buffalo for yourself, then make sure you check out my company, Big Game Hunting Adventures. I'll be hunting with my South Africa hunting outfitter for Cape Buffalo and plains game this summer with my dad. This will be my 5th trip to Africa, and I've been to Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe previously. I've never had a bad hunt in Africa, but I can honestly say the guys I work with in South Africa right now that I'll be hunting with this summer are by far the best I've ever hunted with, and I guarantee they'll treat you right. So if you want a classic safari hunting experience on foot that takes place in a more wild and undeveloped area, then you're the sort of hunter who will probably enjoy what we offer at Big Game Hunting Adventures. I will set you up with an outstanding hunt in South Africa where you will get to hunt in one of the least developed areas left in South Africa, and that area is home to 4 of the big 5, buffalo, lion, leopard, and elephant, and it still has that wild Africa feel to it that you don't find many other places in Africa these days. And don't worry, even though you won't be staying in a 5-star lodge, we do still have a very nice, clean, and comfortable safari camp with electricity, private rooms, hot and cold running water, so you'll eat and sleep well on your hunt while you are enjoying an incredible Africa hunting adventure. And since it's South Africa, it's really easy to travel there. Just fly straight into Johannesburg, and we'll pick you up at the airport and drive you up to the border with Botswana, where you will hunt. No extra flights or plane charters are necessary. There's also some outstanding hunting for both Cape Buffalo and plains game there, and that area is perfect for a buffalo-plains game combination hunt, like we'll be doing this summer, or for a straight buffalo or a straight plains game hunt. I'll be having a great hunt there later this year with my dad, and there's no reason why you can't do that either. So visit BigGameHuntingAdventures.com to learn more, or just click on the link I'm going to put in the show notes. And mention that you heard about Big Game Hunting Adventures through the Big Game Hunting Podcast, and I will give you special pricing on all our hunts. Now, the fact that you are listening to this podcast means that you are serious about making your hunting dreams come true. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.